Good evening. I am so happy to see so many of you here tonight. Happy New Year and welcome to Asia Society Hong Kong Center, and thank you all for taking part in tonight's special memorial dinner. It's special in that tonight this dinner is commemorating the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II and also commemorating the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It's kind of a somber occasion in some ways, but it's also time to celebrate survivors and remembering them. It was 80 years ago, on January 27th, that the Soviet Red Army liberated Auschwitz. Hence, January 27th was chosen by the UN General Assembly in 2005 as the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is to commemorate the loss of 6 million Jews, along with other lives, minorities, that was part of the Nazis' heinous final solutions. Regardless of where we come from, we must remember those we have lost and do our best not to repeat these atrocities. We must also remember their stories of those who perish and those who survive, so that those who come after us do not make the same mistake over and over again. Tonight, we're really excited that you will be able to hear from some of the survivors. In person, we will have Professor Mark Spigelman, a Holocaust survivor himself, and his wife, Mrs Rachel Spigelman. She's child of a Holocaust survivor. And also, we will hear from through technology, thanks to the Hong Kong Holocaust and Tolerance Center, in partnership with the USC Shoah Foundation, we are introducing tonight Dimensions in Testimony. It's an AI-driven project that kind of features interactive testimonies from a Nanjing Massacre survivor, from a Holocaust survivor, and a Chinese comfort woman. You saw in the back there are 3 stations. One is AR, and the other 2 stations are out there, and you will hear directly from Madame Xia and Grandma Peng, and also our speaker from 2 years ago who joined us online, Pinchas Gutter from Canada. And so please, unfortunately, the station by 9 o'clock, they will have to take it away. But what we hope to do with the Holocaust Center is bring these equipments back for future, to share with students as well as our members. And for the students, I know we have students watching this up in the Miller Theater. Please grab, if you saw this, these are QR codes of these stories. After tonight, I think you may want to learn more about their incredible stories. So grab one of this and scan the QR code. I think stories need to be told and need to be remembered, and that's why tonight is a very, very special evening for us to be able to bring you live as well as the technology to share these stories that needs to be shared. Asia Society Hong Kong Center is very grateful to be working again with the Hong Kong Holocaust and Tolerance Center to help mark this year's important milestone. I want to thank you, Rana and Simon, and your team. We're really grateful for your support, as always. We will have remarks from Dr. Roland Vo, Chairman of Hong Kong Holocaust and Tolerance Center, later on this evening when he will formally introduce Professor Spiegelman and Mrs. Rachel Spigelman, our tonight's guests of honors, who will join. I think the Spiegelmans are joining us from all the way from Australia, so we're really delighted they can be here. And those of you who, if you have kids at home or grandkids at home, you may want to grab a copy of Mrs. Rachel Spigelman's book, Blue Eyes Wide Open, and this is the story that she wrote about Mark's incredible story as a kid surviving in Europe. So please feel free to grab a copy of the book, and she'll be happy to sign it after the dinner. So thank you, Mrs. Spigelman, for writing that book. And again, I think the kids, it's never too young, and the book is actually lovely. It's beautifully written, and also beautifully painted. It's actually kind of done in black and white. There's a reason she did that, but you can find out more from her about why. So please, thank you. Allow me also to acknowledge the presence of the Australian Consul General Gareth William, who joined us earlier this evening, and Deputy CG, Deputy Consul General Alastair, I'm going to mix it up. I knew I was going to do that, but Deputy Consul General Alastair, I'm going to let you, we'll do that later, because McCarran, I think I got it close. But thank you, Deputy Consul General, for being here with us for the dinner. And also, later on, we'll be joined by the Israeli Consul General Amir Lati, who will be joining us for the formal part of the program. We are also very delighted to welcome Professor Rana. He is going to be joining us. He is now at Harvard Kennedy School, and he will be joining us virtually from London for the first half of tonight's program, which will begin in about half an hour, 45 minutes. Professor Meter, a noted historian, will set the stage for tonight's program, looking back to World War II. Tonight's dinner and program would not be possible without the support of our generous sponsors. Our gratitude to our 4 chair table sponsors, Lu Mei and Liu Xing, thank you both, and China Frontier Technology Institute, 中国前沿科技研究院. Platinum sponsor, Cynthia and Han So, and gold table sponsor, Dacheng Xuetang, JP Morgan, Morningside, and Seed Foundation Limited. Thank you for your generous support for tonight's dinner, which has allowed us to bring about 25 students who's joining us here at JC Hall, and we have about 62 students in the Miller Theater watching this. And thank you. Without your support, we would not be able to do this dinner. And it's really important that the students are with us for tonight's program. So on that note, enjoy your dinner, and we will be back in a little bit for the next part of the program. And again, I'm really gratified that we can kick off this new year with this really incredible program. And I want to also right now wish you a happy Chinese New Year of the Snake. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. Before I officially welcome Professor Rana, let me just mention that we do have a few of my trustees from the Asia Society Hong Kong that are here. We're delighted that Michael Jepson, I just saw him step out for a bit, but his wonderful daughter is here, which is, of course, even better than the father. But we're delighted that Michael Jepson, our trustee, is with us here today, as well as our new trustee. We have a new trustee, that is Vanessa Gu, that is from Hong Kong. We're also delighted that we have a former speaker who was at that time the Undersecretary of Commerce of the United States being with us here today, Francisco. Great to have you, Francisco Sanchez. Well, Professor Rana, thank you for joining us from, I understand you're in London instead of in Oxford, instead of at Harvard. I just passed through London airport about 12 hours ago. If I had known that, I would have given you a call. But anyway, let me ask everybody a question. I was told that in the corridors of power around the world, be it White House or the Blue House or whatever, Buckingham Palace, the most discussed subject between leaders in those corridors of power was what subject? Anyone knows? History. That's why today we have Professor Rana with us, formerly from Oxford and of course now at Harvard. A lot of people talk about the legacy of colonialism in Asia, but very few people, it seems, other than the academia community, talk about the effect of World War II on Asia and how it has shaped the history of this part of the world. We are so honored and delighted that today Professor Rana can be here with us. He's going to speak for only about 20 minutes. By choice, he will shorten it so that he can take some question, I understand, from the floor, Rana. Thank you very much. And he's going to tell us something about the burden and lessons of history, remembering World War II in Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause to Professor Mitter.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Ronnie, thank you for your welcome. It's great to be part of this event. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person in Hong Kong. I am passing through the UK, but heading back to Harvard, to the Kennedy School, where I now teach for the beginning of spring semester in just a few days' time. So I'm heading west, but it would have been great to be able to head east first, maybe another time. I just wanted to say before I start my talk that I know that there are some guests today who are more comfortable in Putonghua than in English, although I know that everyone is great in both. And so when I speak today, I will pause just after a couple of paragraphs because I know that we have wonderful interpreters, but they need a little time just to translate what I have to say along with my PowerPoint, which I'm going to say in a moment. So if I keep stopping briefly during what I say, that is because we're just allowing the interpreters to put some of my comments into Chinese. And to our guests who are here, who are more comfortable in Putonghua, I just wanted to say a few words. 我很高兴参加这一个重要的纪念活动。今年是第二次世界大战结束89年，我很高兴今天我们记住那场战争期间欧洲的破坏以及中国和亚洲的苦难。我也很高兴我们会记住最重要的是战争不应再次降临到我们两大洲。And I hope that all of us will be thinking about the importance of peace as well as war during our thoughts today on this immensely important anniversary. So 我很感谢我们的翻译 and although my comments will be in English, another time you give me more time, we'll do it in both languages. I hope that everyone will be able to join in the question and answer session. Okay, so Ronnie and company, I assume that everyone can see my PowerPoint. If there's any problem with that, please obviously interrupt and let me know. But I'm assuming that I can show this effectively at the moment.
Good.
Great. Okay, thanks, Ronnie. You'll keep me online if there's any problem with it. Otherwise, if I hear nothing, I'll assume that everything is okay. So the burdens and the lessons of wartime in Asia. In the year 2025, when we are now 80 years from the end of World War II, that conflict that tore apart Europe, Asia, and drew in much of the rest of the globe as well, what is it that in the year 2025 we should bear in mind? Well, I want to start just by reminding you that this part of the world, Hong Kong, China, and Asia more broadly speaking, has been coming to terms with the legacy of World War II for some time. This is a picture of an event slightly under 10 years ago, the 3rd of September 2015. Some of you may have been there. I was there myself, actually in Beijing at the time, but not in the square. And this is in Tiananmen Square, the celebration of the end of World War II after 70 years, the commemoration of the massive loss of life and destruction, and celebration of the fact that 70 years of peace had essentially kept things calm in Europe and Asia during much of that time, even during the difficult years of the Cold War. So China, the country that I have spent many years studying, has certainly thought carefully about the legacy of that World War II experience. And that parade, nearly 10 years ago, is an example of that. We don't, I think, yet know fully what may be happening in China for the 80th anniversary, but I know that there will be academic conferences and other events marking the 80th anniversary, and we'll no doubt find out more during this coming year, 2025. But to say, to bring up the question of legacy and burden of history in East Asia relating to World War II, I would like to spend a little time just saying something about the history of that period. I know there are friends in the audience who have read various of my books, and I hope that this won't be too dull for you since you may know much of it already. But I think there may be people in the audience who are perhaps not so familiar with the history of World War II in China during this period. And I want to just say a little bit on Ronnie's very excellent cue about the history of this period. Of course, China is not the only Asian country that was part of the horrific war that tore Asia apart in the 1930s and 1940s. But it is perhaps the country that even now the wider world knows least about when it comes to the World War II experience. And this map of China is a reminder that the initial outbreak of war in 1937, just outside Beijing at the Marco Polo Bridge, also known by its Chinese name, Lugoqiao, was a trigger point for 8 years of all-out war between China and Japan, the culmination of many decades of the rise of Chinese nationalism on the mainland and the rise of Japanese imperialism in the islands of Japan, a war that would eventually, of course, lead to much destruction across the whole of East and Southeast Asia. I wanted also to take a few minutes to remind ourselves about quite how devastating and quite how destructive that wartime experience was for much of China during that time. Just a reminder again with the map, many of you will be aware that China's government of the time, the Kuomintang, led at that time by Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi, left its wartime capital of Nanjing, which was subjected to a brutal massacre by invading Japanese troops, and moved several hundred miles up the river, up the Yangtze, to Chongqing, where it would essentially maintain a capital city for the next 8 years, until actually 1946, a few months after the end of the war against Japan. During those years of war, particularly in the years from 1938 to about 1941, Chongqing, the temporary wartime capital and seat of resistance to Japan, was subjected to a variety of really terrifying air raids that destroyed much of the city's infrastructure during those years. And here we have a couple of shots of what happened during some of the most horrific air raids during those years. The streets, as will be familiar to you if you know the history of war in Asia or Europe, shaped by those bombings from above that destroyed much of the already quite fragile buildings that marked China's temporary wartime capital. In later years in Europe, the London Blitz has become famous because of the brutality of the destruction of London's infrastructure and buildings under German raids. But it should not be forgotten that Chongqing was the first major city on what would become the Allied side of the war repeatedly to suffer this kind of bombing. And in particular, the events of 3rd and 4th of May 1939 become particularly well noted in this regard, because the city was subjected to a series of almost unceasing air raids over 2 days that turned, in the words of some witnesses, the city of Chongqing into a sea of fire during that period. The 3rd and 4th of May 1939, when these air raids took place, becoming known as the Dahongzha, the great bombing of Chongqing, were particularly notable because they took place exactly on the 20th anniversary of one of the most important moments in the shaping of modern China, the famous May 4th movement, the Wusi Yunong, which of course was marked by a patriotic student demonstration on the 4th of May 1919. So for China's wartime capital city, Chongqing, under the Kuomintang, to be bombed exactly 20 years later, on the 4th of May 1939, was a symbolic moment which great writers like one of China's great modern writers, Lao She, declared was a moment that demanded defiant resistance to the invasion and occupation of China. It was a highly symbolic moment in the midst of destruction, and a reminder of how ideas about commemoration already were beginning to become important even during the years of the war itself. It's also important to notice when we think about the legacy of the Second World War in China and in Asia, to remember that it was not just a time of destruction, although the destruction was terrible, but also a time of building and construction. This document, and again, many, probably all of you can read what it is. It's an account by officials in the Chongqing government of trying to bring about compensation for items that have been destroyed or damaged in an air raid during the 1940s. And you see here that the declaration that these items, bed, quilt, clothes, had all been destroyed, nonetheless needed to be compensated for, and the value is being shown there. In other words, the government of China was beginning to realize that it could not just resist the invasion, it had to build a new society as well. And we see many signs in the historical photographs of that time, of that new society being created in wartime China, even while the flames of war were burning. Examples here of refugees and refugee flight of something like 10 or 11 million people coming to Sichuan province and to Chongqing during this time was a very, very important part of the change in national identity during this period. So here you have young refugee women spinning cloth while waiting, of course, to find out if they would ever return to the homes in eastern China that they had had to flee from. Here we have a torchlight parade of women, again, showing their resistance to the invasion with this set of torchlight demonstrations. And here, young men in uniform being sent off to the front to fight for China against Japan during the years of the war. And even the youngest members of society here, as you see, being mobilized during wartime. In other words, the creation of a total war society in which resistance to occupation was crucial, but also the building of a new society became very central. Most of the concentration here has been on the major resistance carried on by the Kuomintang, the nationalist government of the time. But let's not also forget, one other force was also very important during this period. The largely guerrilla warfare, the Yoji Dui, which were under the command of Chinese communist leadership during this time. Here you have some of the famous Balu Jun, the 8th Route Army fighting in Hebei early on in 1938. But also, of course, there were set-piece battles, most notably under General Peng Dehuai, which led to the rise in power in northern China of the Chinese Communist Party as well. So the united front between the Kuomintang and Chinese Communist Party began to form as an important factor at this point in the war that would later shape post-war politics very profoundly. It's worth pausing for a moment just to remember quite how destructive this war was. Even today, we don't have exact figures for how many people died. But if you add up the figures from different causes of death, combat death, civilian death, deaths from events that were caused directly by the war, such as the famous Henan famine of 1942 to 43, it's certainly likely that the numbers rise from 8 million, 9 million, or even 10 million or more dead during that time. Reliable statistics suggest that 80 to 100 million refugees fled within China during that time. And of course, the painfully constructed infrastructure of China, factories, arsenals, the new cities, great cities like Shanghai, were subjected to bombing and destruction, meaning that China's flawed but real economic growth in the early 20th century began seriously to be damaged during that period. And yet it was also a period when the new world was being shaped, not just the world in China, but a new Asia and a new global society in which China would play a part. And this event was an absolutely central part of that period of change. The Cairo Conference of 1943. Now, this conference ended with a declaration between the Allied powers, the United States, the British Empire, and China, about the way in which post-war Asia would be shaped. Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese leader, was there. Stalin, the Soviet leader, was not there because he was neutral against Japan during that period. But the most important symbolism is that we see the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of the British Empire, and the President and leader of China and the Generalissimo, Jiang Jieshi, Chiang Kai-shek, sitting together in equal standing. This was the end of China's semi-colonial period and the beginning of a period of equality for China as an Asian power which would play a global role, for instance, in organizations such as the new United Nations organization. And it's worth noting that Chinese leaders today, including Foreign Minister Wang Yi and, of course, Xi Jinping, talk about the way in which China was the first signatory to the United Nations Charter. And, of course, it was Chiang Kai-shek here who was central to that signing of the Charter at San Francisco in 1945. He wasn't there himself throughout the whole proceedings, but he was nonetheless represented by a whole variety of actors from both the nationalist and also the Communist Party of China. Worth remembering that the United Front continued all the way into 1945 in various ways. So let's use that thought to think a little bit in the last few minutes about the legacy and the memory of World War II in China. Because, of course, that period of Chinese history, although it was formative for shaping a new Asia, changed very rapidly. Of course, there was a civil war that followed the war against Japan, when the two previously united sides, the Kuomintang nationalists and the communists, fought with each other in a period of brutal civil war. Of course, eventually the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, won on the mainland, and of course is still very much in control today. But in recent years, there has been much more interest in reviving the memory of that period of unity within the Chinese mainland itself. And it's worth remembering that some of those memories are very inwardly directed in terms of China, and some speak to a wider Asian identity. So books like this, Qu Da Hou Fang, in which people talk about their memories of being evacuated to Chongqing in the wartime period, have a lot of resonance with people both in Europe and Asia who also suffered from that great period of human displacement, when people across Asia and Europe were forced to leave their homes and suffer for many years, unsure if they would ever return to their hometowns. And that legacy of refugee status and trauma continued well into the post-war period, and of course in some ways is still very much with us today in countries in Europe and Asia. In Asia, many countries, including, for instance, Myanmar, see a massive refugee crisis as Rohingya refugees are forced out of the borders of Myanmar into Bangladesh. In Europe, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course, has seen huge numbers of Ukrainian refugees having to flee to Germany, Britain, and other European countries. So that wartime experience is rooted in history. But today's powerful countries, the US, European Union, and China, should draw on that history of knowing their own suffering at the time of refugee crisis to think about how those problems should be solved in the present day. Similarly, there are museums and memorials all over China that recall those periods of World War II, such as this book, 一个人的抗战, by the writer and curator Fan Zhenchuan, which talks movingly about this period of World War II and how it has shaped China's identity in the contemporary period of the 21st century. There's also repeated and renewed pride in China's own experiences fighting invasion. And here, this book, the Great War of Resistance of the People of Sichuan, is just one example of how China's provinces have rediscovered pride in memory of their own wartime experience as part of a wider national recollection of that period. Chongqing, also the old wartime capital of China, has spent a great deal of time reminding China and international audience about its period as a place of wartime resistance. And this documentary, which actually is 20 years old, it came from the 60th anniversary of the war in 2005, the Kangjian Peidu temporary capital during the War of Resistance, reminds viewers that along with London, Moscow, and Washington, D.C., which you see symbolized there, Chongqing was also a major Allied wartime capital. And today, a different version of that Jinianbei, the memorial tower, the memorial monument, stands in the center of Chongqing. And many of you, I'm sure, will have seen that. Let me finish with a couple of thoughts about where this legacy, burden, and memory might lead us in the present day. I think we all know that the Asia-Pacific space continues to be a very turbulent one in political terms. And certainly the legacy of that wartime experience and the great Titanic War between China and Japan, but also the Japanese imperial expansion around the region in Southeast Asia, has produced many memories, many of them traumatic, but also very formative in terms of shaping the Asia of today. Today's great task is to remember how horrific, how unconscionable the destruction of large parts of Asia was during those wartime years. If I may, I'll just take it. Oh gosh, sorry, got that there. We take that back. Nope, sorry, I'm not going to. Never mind. Well, I won't, since I'm finding the video difficult to work, I won't go back. But just to remind you, those pictures of the terrible air raids on Chongqing are a reminder of how destructive war is in general. And a reminder that one of the legacies, 80 years on at the end of World War II, is that even now in Asia, as in Europe, World War II continues to shape the order and the societies that we live in. We're still very much in the shadow of that war. But the burden that we have as later generations is to make sure that that conflict is never repeated on either continent, and that the most important task is to put away petty nationalisms, to put away the territorial and maritime disputes which still so often seem to dog the interaction between the various countries of this region and of other regions as well, and instead work out how there can be a lasting order in which everyone has a voice, but nobody seeks to dominate. That surely is the most important legacy and the most important burden to bear when we think about the terrible destruction that happened in Asia during World War II, and what we, in following generations, 80 years on, should make our most important task as we think how to avoid it ever happening again. Ronnie, thank you very much for your time today. It's been a privilege to speak to this group, and we have a few minutes, I think, for some questions and answers if you would like to do that now. But I'll
Thank you, Rana. Thank you very much. I know that you have we have a hard stop in 15 minutes. So let me lead off with a question, and then the rest of you, please feel free to raise your hand as the first question goes on. Rana, let me ask you one thing. It's you mentioned that that photograph in 1943 Cairo, when the Chinese leader in that time, Chiang Kai-shek, 平起平坐, he was in equal footing with Roosevelt of the United States and Churchill of England, of Britain. That is a very perceptive observation. So the rise of China, or indeed the rise of Asia, was perhaps expected even during the end of the Second World War. But I suppose China chose in subsequent years after the Civil War to sort of retreat from the much of the rest of the economic activities of the world, and China sort of became a little isolated for several decades, until perhaps we may say 1979, when Deng Xiaoping opened up the country again. But in the interim, Japan rose. I think a lot of people may be surprised that Japan should have risen so fast, and then followed by the four little tigers, including Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea, and Singapore. And then finally, of course, 1979, the big dragon, so to speak, China finally woke up and began to participate. So I'm always curious that I know that it is a hypothetical question. What if China had not gone through this period of retreating to itself for about 3 decades until 1979? What would the world look like? How would the West treat China otherwise? Would they still treat Japan the same way they did, as a counterbalance to communist China, I suppose, as well as to Russia? So can you make some comments on that post-war period of how it determines the future shape of Asia right after World War II?
Ronnie, I'd be delighted to answer that question. I'll tell you the reason I'm delighted to do that is that right now I am trying to finish off writing a book manuscript, which is exactly about this period, the late 1940s, after the war with Japan was over, and looking at what the different pathways were for China at that time and thinking about how things went and what might have been different. So first of all, if I might just, your question was so perceptive, but there's one element that I'd push back slightly. In the period after 1949, after the Communist Revolution, actually China wasn't isolated. It was separated from the United States and some of the Western world. But of course, it was very much in a close alliance with the Soviet Union for more than 10 years. And that alliance with first Stalin and then his successors, at least for a period, was a really important shaping moment for the early years of communist China under Mao Zedong. So really the period of kind of isolation in a broad sense, I think really is just the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76. Rather, I would regard China as having gone through a phase of having alliances or partnerships with different groupings and different countries, the Soviets, then isolation, and then the United States. And I think that's important because actually it says something about where we are now. I think that in 1945, there is no doubt that the wider world expected China to rise. Let me give you another fact that people sometimes forget. In 1945, at least at the very moment when Japan was defeated and the New World was beginning, China was still one of the very few, and probably the largest country that was genuinely sovereign. One of the products of China's wartime experience, fighting alongside the Allies with the British and the Americans, was that in 1943, the so-called new treaties, the Xinqiaoyue, were declared that essentially ended the old Treaty of Nanjing, which had put China in a semi-colonized position. And so as a result, China was free in a way that wasn't yet true of India, wasn't true of most of the colonies of Southeast Asia, which were given back to their European imperial rulers. And that meant that China had a chance really to shape a great deal of how that world emerged. So for instance, I mentioned the United Nations, and we know that significant figures, people like Sun Tzu-wen and others, became a very important part of those changes. It's worth remembering that actually one significant figure in the CCP, Dong Biwu, also went to San Francisco and was part of those UN discussions. I think that had there been, the success of, say, a coalition government in 1946-47, and both the communists and Kuomintang did spend some time discussing this before essentially ending up in a civil war, then I think we probably would have seen a China that had both strong relations with the United States and with the Soviet Union. And that would have been an intriguing possibility. In other words, a kind of power broker that had to deal with both superpowers, but was also open to both in terms of trade in terms of changing constitution. Don't forget, China introduced in 1947 a really important new constitutional change that set up a national assembly. The problem ended up with being that the Kuomintang and communists couldn't both agree to participate in that national assembly. But a China which had essentially moved to a more constitutional system, one that had a role at the United Nations, one that was part of the international trading system, one that could talk to Moscow and Washington, well, that would have been a much more cosmopolitan China that is an intriguing counterfactual, even though historians have to note that it didn't actually happen, but the seeds were perhaps there.
Well, after all, China was one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations, together with the Soviet Union and then the rest of the 3 Western countries. Okay, any question from the floor, you better raise your hand. If not, I'm going to continue going, okay? I got tons of questions for Rana. I don't see any hands so far. 1, 2, and 3. I count to 3 if I don't hear anyone. Rana, let me ask you another one. For whatever it is worth, history is history. And China today finally has risen since 1979, economically first, and of course coming with it is the political influence and that technological advancement and so forth. But for whatever it is worth, the last 80 years in Asia, it has generally been a pretty peaceful place, with the exception of regional war like the Vietnam War. That's really a regional conflict. The big boys, the Japan, China, really didn't get into serious trouble with each other. But looking forward from today, do you think that peace will hold, especially now that Donald Trump became the president 3 days ago again? Is that a harbinger of some trouble coming in Asia? Or do you think that Asia should be able to hold it together and have peace for another, hopefully prolonged period of time?
Thanks, Ronnie. Well, I think it's probably the single most important question of our times. And first of all, I have to say that there's no reason that I can think of to see that any American president actually has any interest in conflict in the Asia Pacific. If we know one thing about President Trump, and he's said it over and over again, he says he's looking to be a peacemaker. And if you look at what's happening in other parts of the world, actually, whether you agree with the end results or not, all of the directions of travel for his foreign policy at the moment seem to be about trying to end conflicts in part of the world. He's not concentrating on East Asia so much at the moment, but we see new moves in the Middle East. We see a ceasefire at the moment, which I think many people are immensely pleased to see, and let's hope that that holds. And also, of course, new moves in Europe as well, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has caused huge destruction in Ukraine when their territory was invaded some 3 years ago. So I suspect that there will be a move to try and work out how peace and stability, more broadly speaking, can be done, not least because I think President Trump wants to rewrite the international trade system as well. And the one thing we know is that for international trade, you need a peaceful environment. But let's talk about that wider question that underlies what you're saying. And I think that is really important. Where is stability going to come from? Well, I'm going to give you one concept, and that is regional organizations. Look at the way that ASEAN, for instance, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has really been changing in role over decades in the last few years. It was started under American sponsorship in the 1960s as really an anti-communist move. Today, of course, ASEAN itself contains several communist countries, including Vietnam. But more important, it sits as a stabilizing force, a way for some of the emerging economies of Asia to say, when it comes to economics, when it comes to security, when it comes to culture, we're not the business of telling other people what to do, but we have our own agenda, and we're not simply going to be pushed around by the United States or by China or by any other country. We have our own voice, and we want that heard. Then look at the way in which a whole variety of different trading organizations have emerged in the region. There's the RCEP, the Regional Common Economic Partnership, which China has been very central in. There's CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Japan has really taken a leadership role in pushing forward. In other words, if we think of Asia today not as a cauldron of conflict, but actually as, let's say, a great dim sum restaurant with a menu with lots of different choices on it. I think a lot of actors in Asia, not just countries, not just leaders, but middle classes, business people, cultural figures can find lots of different opportunities to actually make sure that their voices are heard. And I think it's in hearing those voices that the most important outcome, the continuation of the peace and stability, which rightly, as you've pointed out, we've had really since the early 1980s in Asia, continues. And in terms of peace, stability, and economic prosperity, I think that's essential not just for Asia, but actually for a world which currently is in a worrying economic situation.
Okay, then let me ask perhaps the last or the next to the last question. Oh, that's a hand there. Okay, Jason, right? Jason, sure. He's a banker, will forgive you. Please, right in front of you. Yeah, please.
Thanks, Ronnie.
In this organization, we know your wife very well. But well, anyway, we welcome you as well.
Thank you, Ronnie. And Rana, if I may say on behalf of everyone here, you do deliver a lot of content in a very short time. I appreciate your words and your thoughts tonight. Thinking about trade, and we talk about Trump there, when you look at history and how history can rhyme and how we need to try to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, when you think about trade and perhaps the end of globalization in this era, the tariffs that we hear so much about, etc. Does that worry you on a 10, 20-year view? Does it worry you that as countries rely less on each other and try to look more inward, does that worry you about the prospect for future conflict?
Well, first of all, Jason, thanks very much for your kind words, and I will do my best to live up to your question by trying to give some content in a short answer. Trade and tariffs, I think, clearly, if exercised across the board in a very wholesale way, could be very damaging. I think, at the moment, at the beginning phase of a new administration in the US, a lot of people are wondering how much in the talk about tariffs is literally a policy and how much is the beginning of a negotiating position. You'll notice that in the first few days of the new administration, we haven't yet actually seen the imposition of these tariffs. They were not part of the day one strategy. A lot of other things were. So let's see in the short term where they go. But let me ask your question, Jason, which is really about the long term. And I think that that's the interesting and important way to go. I have a reflection actually on the long term in a piece that, sorry, advertising, but it'll be coming out in the journal Foreign Affairs in the next edition for March. And it's actually a reflection on a series of possible outcomes for China and the world, that China deals with in 20 years' time. And I say quite a few things in that piece, but one thing I think we need to guard against is the danger not of a hold-up necessarily in terms of classic trade, in terms of trading goods. I think people will always trade goods when they want to buy them. But in terms of a trade in ideas, one of the things that I think will be very worrying in the European Union, in the United States, and in China is if a trend towards shutting off knowledge exchange becomes more notable. I think there's no secret, and everyone in this audience will know that there is an increasingly adversarial relationship between the liberal world, broadly defined, and China. But nonetheless, one of the things that has kept relations as smooth as they can be and has helped both sides to improve knowledge of each other is being able to engage in cultural and knowledge and scientific exchange on both sides. Right now, I think we are in danger of walking into a world in which both sides are doing their best to try and preserve as much knowledge in their own system and prevent the full capacity of people from the other side to actually engage in that sort of interaction. It's difficult now, frankly, for researchers to go into China and have the kind of free capacity to do social science, humanities, and indeed scientific research that was quite possible in China under the same party and the same system just 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's also become more difficult for Chinese researchers to come into some Western countries as well. And I would say in both cases, Beijing, Washington, Brussels, London, wherever, need to understand that the really damaging thing could be if those knowledge flows begin to reduce and turn inward in the next 15, 20 years. That, Jason, is where I think a real danger lies. And I hope everyone in this room in Hong Kong, one of the great cultural hubs of the world and a hub for education, will push that message forward very, very strongly. Because, of course, you have a voice in London, you have a voice in the United States, where there's many people from Hong Kong working, and you have a voice in China as well. And all of those groups need to hear what Hong Kong thinks about what I think is a central issue for your knowledge base of universities, innovation, entrepreneurship, and companies.
Rana, can you take one last question?
Of course, absolutely.
Okay. We were all expecting that after World War II, Asia would rise, as you indicated, including China. But it really didn't happen, except to surprise of many. Japan was the first one to rise. But Asia being so big, Japan is only 120 million people. And then, of course, gradually South Korea and so forth. And finally, China rise. And so perhaps this is 60 years later than people expected. Instead of 1945, it didn't happen until 2005 or some such dates. Do you see that? How do you see the role of Asia going forward in the world scene? Is that going to be a source of trouble? Or do you think that elsewhere are so bad, be it Ukraine or Middle East or somewhere, that Asia will still be a relatively peaceful place? And what role in general do you see Asia playing in the post-World War II and now post-China rise world?
Absolutely, Ronnie. Well, that's a great question to end with, because I think it speaks so much to why these issues of World War II are still so important. I mean, again, that one point from history you've made, and let's just make it one more time because it's so important, is that the wider world, including the US and Europe, expected China to be fully integrated into the global economy, did not expect it to become essentially a partner of the Soviet Union under a revolutionary government. In 1945. And just 5 years later, the situation had completely changed. People, even in the Soviet Union, Stalin was quite surprised about that. And so that shift happened very, very fast and set history on a different path from what people had expected. So what that reminds us is that it's difficult to make predictions, or dangerous, because even in a few years, things might change fast. But nonetheless, in the next few years, the most dangerous thing that could happen for the region and for the global economy would be armed conflict in Asia, whether it was around the question of Taiwan or the South China Sea or a whole variety of other issues. It's very important that all sides prioritize peace first. Those are more important than, the legacies of historical memory and nationalism and so forth. Keeping peace for the 21st century has to be the key task. And the reward would be great, because Asia is, amongst other things, still the most populous part of the world, with India and China in it. It's still the most economically dynamic part of the world. The Chinese economy itself in the mainland, as you know, Ronnie, is changing in form as the demographic changes. China's becoming older, but it's very, very important in terms of anchoring much of the regional economy as younger societies, such as Indonesia, and much of Southeast Asia, begin to change their roles as well. And I think that in terms of the important economic arguments of the next 15 years, the production of green post-fossil fuel energy, the ability of a newly educated middle class to create technology that doesn't just come from Silicon Valley or Western Europe or even from China, but from elsewhere in the region. Asia has the brains, it has the capital, it has the markets, it has the dynamism to succeed in all those areas and to become perhaps the most dynamic region of the globe for 10 or 20 years to come. But for that to happen, the region must be at peace. And that, I think, is the lesson from World War II. And looking at those pictures that I showed you of wartime China reminds us of what the alternative looks like, that keeping that peace has to be an absolutely core message for anyone involved in the economics, geopolitics, or culture of Asia for the next decade and more.
Thank you, Professor Rana Mitter. A round of applause to our professor from Harvard University. Thank you.